The most important part to any zoo is the animals in the enclosures they call home. Throughout the series, I'll be designing different enclosures for an array of animals, whilst also keeping guest interaction at the forefront of every build. Join me each week as I tackle a new enclosure and idea and try and bring it to life within Planet Zoo. To kickstart the series, I have decided to build a red panda enclosure. I felt like this was the right animal to start with because they are fairly common within zoos and are well liked, but not a main draw to a zoo, as I don't want too much pressure on myself for my first build. I have seen plenty of red panda enclosures when visiting zoos, and they follow a similar theme: circular, oval style enclosures with plants or water around the perimeter, with lots of trees and climbing equipment in the middle. So I wanted to utilise these ideas that I have seen into my build, whilst also adding an oriental theme to the enclosure to replicate the part of the world red pandas are from. Here are some of the stats for red pandas. We have land requirement, climbing requirement, water requirement, temperature requirement and boundary requirements. Now, although on here it says water requirements aren't necessary, sometimes water can feature within the enclosure like mentioned earlier. Climbing is obviously an important part, and the land that they need is another thing to take into consideration, as well as the temperature, which you'll see I add a cooler to the enclosure later on in the build. Here we have some more stats on the red panda, including their social group and how that's made up and whether they can interact with humans or not, and if guests can enter their habitat. Underneath we have the size for both male and female red pandas, as well as the weight and life expectancy of both. And underneath that we have the life cycle of a red panda all on the screen there to give you an idea of what we need to include for this enclosure. I start off by getting the simple layout of the enclosure that I want, and as you can see here I'm going for a sort of oval shape with quite a low wall, and I'm just sort of building that together now, sort of making up the size as I go along, and you'll see here that I move it slightly closer to the path, obviously keeping guest interaction at the forefront of every build. Here I'm just sort of messing about trying to find sort of items I want to use to build up the wall. As you can see here, I've gone for a sort of little New World style fencing just to add a bit of height to the wall on areas of the enclosure that guests won't really have access to. And as you can see, I'm sort of just working my way around the back of the enclosure where the staff area will be. Here I'm taking out a bit of the wall where I want the staff access to be, and at this point I decided this would be the best time to implement the fences within the game to stop the animals from escaping and also making up the enclosure, because at current I only have the wall. So I go with the null fencing because this is invisible to the guests, and obviously it allows me to use my own wall structures. And here I am placing the entrance, and there it is, and I'm just trying to sort of work out a way to connect it to the staff area, which I'm doing now. I've just finished up the back wall there, and at this point I'm trying to find some sort of pillars to fill in the gaps there, which you can see, so that the animal can't escape. And it was to sort of stick with the oriental theme that I wanted to implement in the enclosure. As you can see, I went for the red pillars, and here I am trying to add a sign which will say red pandas, to indicate to the keepers that this is where they need to enter for the red panda enclosure. After a bit of faffing, I finally get the sign up and ready for where I want it to be, which I place just there. Now it's time to crack on with adding things to the enclosure. Before I started inside the enclosure, I decided to work on the outside, and this involved adding the oriental theme that I mentioned earlier to the enclosure, so it didn't just look like a grey wall. So here I'm adding some red fencing all around the edge, just to sort of tidy it up a little bit. And this is where I toyed with the idea of some more sort of stylized background, just to cover up some of the work area so it was out of guest view, just in case the trees I had later on wasn't enough. I then came across these cute little red panda sort of ornament things, and I decided to add them to the corner here so that guests had something to see, and it was a nice little thing to fill in that gap there. But now it was time to move on from outside the enclosure and work on what the enclosure would look like on the inside, and adding things for the red pandas themselves. Just at the end there of that previous clip, I was adding a bridge. I decided against it in the end. I now have the red panda placed within the enclosure, and as you can see, I'm trying to find the right balance for the terrain for the red panda. So here I am adding rogs and short grass just to get the terrain right. So now the enclosure was looking a little bit bare, I decided to add some foliage around the edge. This also keeps the animal in the enclosure, and here you can see I'm adding some trees for some height, just to get some sort of perspective. Here are some blossom trees going in. I wanted a bit of colour within the enclosure. I didn't want just green and orange, so there was a bit of pink, and here was some reeds. And as you can see, I spend a lot of time toying with different trees, plants and foliage to get it right. With the foliage done, I decided to move on to the apparatus within the enclosure for the red pandas to climb on. So here I am adding a load of pre-built designs just to speed up the process a little bit, and also because I'm not very confident with the building apparatus tool. So here I am just sort of fiddling about and moving things about, seeing what's best from the guest point of view. Now I'm adding some rocks to the enclosure and different types of branches just to fill out the space, and really sort of add some depth and colour within the enclosure itself. I'm now just adding the final finishing touches to the enclosure, like the water and feeding station, as well as the cooler to the enclosure so the temperature is right for the red panda. And that is pretty much the build. Here is the final result.